Sometimes the smallest hands carry the biggest hearts. In 1889, deep in Apache territory, 8-year-old Itzel heard something that would haunt her dreams, the agonized cries of a massive grizzly bear caught in barbed wire. Most children would run. Most adults would too. But Itzel saw past the claws and teeth to something deeper, pain that called to her soul. With bleeding fingers and whispered prayers, she freed the mighty creature from its metal prison. The bear didn't attack. Instead, it did something that left everyone who heard the story speechless. Years later, when war threatened to destroy her people, that same bear would return to repay an old debt. How could one child's act of kindness change the fate of an entire tribe? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested the rim of the hidden canyon, painting the sandstone walls in shades of amber and gold. Smoke from the cooking fires rose in lazy spirals toward the endless Arizona sky, carrying with it the scent of cornmeal and sage. This was the valley that time forgot, where the Chiricahua Apache had carved out a sanctuary far from the eyes of soldiers and settlers, a place where the old ways still flourished like the desert wildflowers after summer rain. 8-year-old Itzel sat cross-legged beside her grandmother's wickiup, her small fingers working methodically through a collection of healing herbs spread across a woven mat. The ancient medicine pouch, crafted from soft doeskin and adorned with turquoise beads, rested beside her, its contents carefully sorted and examined. This pouch had belonged to her great-grandmother and her great-great-grandmother before, that passed down through generations of women who understood the sacred language between plants and people. "Tell me again about the bear spirit, grandmother," Itzel whispered, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the morning fire. Her voice carried that peculiar quality of old souls trapped in young bodies, wise beyond her years, yet still touched with the wonder of childhood. Nayeli's weathered hands paused in their grinding of acorn flour. At 73 winters, she had seen the world change in ways that would have seemed impossible in her youth. The railroad had carved its iron path across the desert. Telegraph poles stood like skeleton trees against the horizon. White men with their strange customs and stranger diseases had swept across the land like a flash flood, leaving nothing unchanged in their wake. "The bear is more than animal, little flower," Nayeli said, using the pet name she had given Itzel. At birth, in the time before memory, when the world was young and the spirits walked openly among us, the Great Spirit appointed guardians for every sacred place. Some took the form of eagles, some became the mountain lions, others the wolves. But for our valley, for this special place where the earth holds its breath, the Great Spirit chose the bear. Itzel's small hands had stopped their sorting. She leaned forward, captivated as always by her grandmother's stories. The hand-carved wooden bear totem that her grandfather had made for her 5th birthday hung from a leather cord around her neck, warm against her chest. The tiny figurine bore intricate details, each claw carefully etched, each eye a small inlaid piece of obsidian that seemed to watch and wait. "But I have never seen such a bear, grandmother. Perhaps you have not looked with the right eyes." Nayeli replied, her own gaze distant. "The spirits reveal themselves only when the need is great, or when they find a heart pure enough to understand their message." Across the camp, Itzel's father Chaitin emerged from the larger wickiup that housed their family. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much change too quickly, yet refused to let it break his spirit. His long black hair was braided with eagle feathers earned through acts of courage and leadership. Unlike many of the younger men who spoke of war and resistance, Chaitin believed in the power of patience and wisdom. "The council meets today," he announced to his wife Ayana, who was tending to their infant son near the fire. "The soldiers have been seen again, 3 days' ride to the east." Ayana looked up from the baby, her expression troubled. She was younger than her husband by several years, but motherhood had brought a gravitas to her features that made her seem ageless. How many this time? Perhaps 20. They wear the blue coats of the cavalry, but they do not ride like men seeking war. Chayton settled beside his family, accepting the bowl of acorn mush his wife offered. Lieutenant Morrison leads them, the young officer who speaks some of our tongue and treats our people with respect. And the other one? Ayana's voice carried a note of concern. The one with the cold eyes? Chayton's jaw tightened. Captain Whitfield remains at Fort Bowie, for now. Itzel absorbed this conversation as she always did, quietly, completely, understanding more than adults realized. She had seen Captain Whitfield once, when her family had traveled to the fort for treaty talks. The man's pale eyes had swept over her people as if they were obstacles to be removed, rather than human beings to be respected. Even at her young age, she had felt something dark and hungry in his gaze. "Papa," she said softly, "will we have to leave our valley?" Chayton's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. Among all the Apache, children were treasured beyond measure, their innocence protected fiercely, yet he had always been honest. With Itzel, recognizing the unusual wisdom that lived behind her young eyes. "The white men speak of moving all Apache people to a place called San Carlos," he said carefully. "It is many days' journey to the south, in a land of little water and harsh sun. They say it would be safer for everyone if all the Apache lived in one place." "But this is our place," Itzel protested, her small hand touching the earth beneath her. "The spirits of our ancestors are buried here. The sacred springs flow here. How can we leave the places that hold our prayers?" From her spot beside the fire, Nayeli nodded approvingly. "You see, even the little ones understand what the white men cannot. Land is not something to be owned like a horse or a blanket. Land is our mother, our teacher, our sacred trust. To abandon it is to abandon ourselves." The morning progressed with the familiar rhythms that had governed Apache life for countless generations. The women prepared food, tended children, and worked on the endless tasks that kept a community alive. The men maintained weapons, cared for horses, and planned hunting expeditions. The children played games that taught them the skills they would need as adults: tracking, hiding, moving silently through the brush. But underneath the surface normalcy, tension hummed like the string of a bow drawn taut. Everyone felt it. The older people remembered when the army was just a distant rumor. The younger adults had grown up during the Apache Wars, when leaders like Cochise and Geronimo had fought to preserve their way of life. Now in 1889, those wars were ending not with victory or defeat, but with the slow, grinding pressure of inevitability. Itzel spent the afternoon with the other children, learning from her cousin Paloma how to weave yucca fibers into baskets. But her attention kept drifting to the canyon walls that surrounded their hidden valley. Somewhere beyond those red stone barriers, the world was changing in ways that would reshape everything she knew. "You are troubled, little cousin," Paloma observed. At 12, she was old enough to notice such things. "Your hands work, but your spirit is elsewhere." "I keep thinking about the bear spirit grandmother told me about," Itzel admitted. "If the Great Spirit appointed guardians for sacred places, where is ours? Why doesn't it protect us from the soldiers?" Paloma considered this with the seriousness. Apache children brought to all spiritual matters. Perhaps the guardian is waiting for the right time, or perhaps it is already protecting us in ways we cannot see. As evening approached, the tribal council gathered around the central fire. Itzel was supposed to help her mother prepare the evening meal, but she found herself drawn to the edge of the circle, listening to the low voices of the men discussing their people's future. Old Chief Victorio's son, a man called Swift Arrow, spoke first. "The soldiers grow bolder each moon. They no longer ask permission to cross our lands. They simply come. Soon they will demand that we come to them." "Let them demand," growled another voice. "We are Apache. We do not bow to the wishes of men who know nothing of honor. And how many of our children will die for that pride?" Chayton's voice cut through the bluster like a blade. "I have seen what happens when the bluecoats decide a tribe is too troublesome. Do you remember Sand Creek, Wounded Knee, the Washita River?" Silence fell over the council. Every Apache knew these names, places where the U.S. Army had killed, not just warriors, but women, children, elders, entire communities wiped out in the name of progress and civilization. "Then what do you counsel, Chaitin?" Swift Arrow asked. "That we pack our belongings and walk meekly to their reservation?" "I counsel wisdom," Chaitin replied. "I counsel that we remember our children come before our pride. If we must bend like the willow to survive the storm, then we bend. A living tree can grow straight again when the wind stops blowing." From her place in the shadows, Itzel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. She touched the bear totem at her throat and whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her, a prayer for protection, for guidance, for the wisdom to see the path forward when all paths seemed blocked. As the council debate continued long into the night, Itzel slipped away to her favorite spot on a ledge overlooking the valley. The stars spread above her like scattered diamonds, the same stars her ancestors had watched for generations beyond counting. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the canyon walls, she could hear the night sounds of the desert, the call of owls, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the distant howl of coyotes singing their ancient songs. But tonight, underneath those familiar sounds, she heard something else, something that made her small heart race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. It was faint, almost beyond hearing, but unmistakable to ears trained from birth to read the language of the wilderness, the deep, rumbling call of a bear. Itzel pressed her hand to the wooden totem at her throat and felt it pulse with warmth like a living heartbeat. Somewhere out there in the vast darkness, something was stirring, something that had been waiting, perhaps for longer than she could imagine. "I hear you," she whispered to the night wind. "I am listening." The sound came once more, closer now, carrying with it a message she felt in her bones rather than understood with her mind. Change was coming to the hidden valley, change that would test everything her people believed about courage, wisdom, and the sacred bonds that connected all living things. But tonight, wrapped in starlight and ancient prayers, 8-year-old Itzel made a promise to the darkness and the spirits that moved within it. Whatever came, whatever trials awaited her people, she would be ready. She would listen with the right ears and see with the right eyes. She would be worthy of the trust her ancestors had placed in her. As she finally made her way back to her family's wickiup, the bear totem warm against her chest, Itzel could not have known that her promise would be tested sooner than anyone could imagine, or that the fate of not just her people, but the land itself, would soon rest in her small, determined hands. 3 days after the council meeting, Itzel woke before dawn, with her heart pounding from dreams she couldn't quite remember. Images of silver wire and dark fur, of pain so deep it seemed to echo through the earth itself, lingered at the edges of her consciousness like smoke from a dying fire. The bear totem at her throat felt unusually warm, almost alive against her skin. The wickiup was still dark, filled with the soft breathing of her sleeping family. Her baby brother made small sounds in his sleep, and her parents lay curled together, like animals seeking comfort in uncertain times. But sleep had abandoned Itzel completely, chased away by a restlessness that seemed to pull at her very bones. Moving with the silence that came naturally to all Apache children, she slipped from beneath her sleeping furs and crept toward the entrance. The pre-dawn air was crisp and clean, scented with sage and the distant promise of rain. Stars still glittered overhead, but the eastern horizon showed the first faint blush of approaching sunrise. Something called to her from beyond the canyon. Walls, a wordless summons that bypassed her mind and spoke directly to her spirit. Without conscious decision, her feet began carrying her toward the narrow trail that led up and out of the hidden valley. Her grandmother's warnings about venturing alone beyond the safe boundaries echoed in her memory, but the pull was stronger than caution. The climb took longer than usual. Her 8-year-old legs were strong from a lifetime in the desert mountains, but the sense of urgency that drove her made every step feel slow and labored. By the time she reached the canyon rim, the sky had lightened enough to reveal the vast landscape spreading in all directions, mesas and arroyos, scattered juniper and ancient saguaro cactus, the bones of a land that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless peoples. The sound reached her before she saw its source, a low, continuous moaning that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was the sound of something in terrible pain, something large and powerful, reduced to helpless suffering. Following the awful noise, Itzel made her way carefully along the rim until she could peer down into a shallow depression, where floods had carved twisted channels in the red rock. What she saw made her gasp aloud. A massive grizzly bear, larger than any she had ever imagined, was trapped in a nightmare of gleaming wire. The barbed metal, probably fencing material from some distant ranch, had been carried here by wind or flood and tangled among the rocks like a giant's web. The bear had somehow become entangled in its coils, and its struggles to free itself had only made the trap more secure. Blood matted the creature's thick brown fur where the barbs had bitten deep. One massive paw was caught at an agonizing angle, and bloody gouges marked where the wire had cut into the bear's neck and shoulders. Yet what struck Itzel most powerfully was not the physical damage, but the look in the animal's small, dark eyes. This was no ordinary bear. There was an intelligence there, an ancient wisdom that seemed to recognize her presence and measure her soul. Every instinct screamed at her to run. Bears were dangerous under the best circumstances, and a wounded, trapped bear was deadly beyond imagination. Her father had told her stories of hunters who had died from single swipes of grizzly claws. Her grandmother's teachings emphasized respect for all creatures, but also the wisdom of keeping safe distance from predators. But as she stared down at the suffering giant, all Itzel could see was pain. Pure, desperate pain that called to something deep within her spirit. The bear totem at her throat grew warmer, and she could swear she heard her grandmother's voice carried on the morning wind. The spirits reveal themselves only when the need is great, or when they find a heart pure enough to understand their message. "I see you," she whispered to the trapped bear. "I understand." The descent into the depression was treacherous. Loose rock shifted under her small feet, and more than once she nearly lost her balance. But something guided her steps. The same force that had called her from sleep, perhaps, or simply the determination that filled her young heart. The bear watched her approach with eyes that held no threat, only a vast, patient intelligence that seemed older than the mountains themselves. When she was close enough to see the individual, barbs in the wire, close enough to smell the wild musk of the bear's fur mixed with the copper scent of blood, Itzel stopped. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady as she began to sing one of the healing songs her grandmother had taught her, a wordless melody that spoke of comfort and connection between all living things. The bear's struggles ceased. Its massive head turned toward her, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, girl and beast regarded each other across the vast gulf that usually separated their kinds. Then, impossibly, the grizzly extended its trapped paw toward her, as if asking for help. Working with infinite care, Itzel began to untangle the maze of barbed wire. Her small fingers could reach places the bear's bulk made inaccessible. When the wire resisted, she used a sharp piece of flint to cut through the metal strands. The barbs bit into her hands, drawing thin lines of blood that mixed with the bear's, but she barely noticed the pain. "Be still, grandfather," she murmured, using the Apache term of respect for elder spirits. "I will free you. I promise." It took most of the morning. The sun climbed higher, heating the rock depression until sweat beaded on Itzel's forehead. Her hands grew slick with blood, both her own and the bear's, but she worked with the patience her people were famous for. Wire by wire, barb by barb, she slowly unraveled the trap that held the great creature. When the last strand fell away, the bear didn't immediately move. It lay still for a long moment, as if testing the reality of its freedom. Then, with surprising grace for something so massive, it rolled to its feet and shook itself. Blood still stained its fur, and it would carry scars from this encounter for the rest of its life, but the terrible tension of trapped desperation was gone. Itzel sat back on her heels, exhausted and amazed by what she had accomplished. Her small hands were crisscrossed with cuts from the barbed wire, and her deerskin dress was stained with blood and dirt. But as she looked up at the towering form of the grizzly, she felt no fear, only a deep sense of connection that seemed to flow between them like water finding its course. The bear looked down at her for a long moment, its dark eyes holding depths of wisdom that spoke of years beyond counting. Then, in a gesture that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not witnessed it, the massive creature slowly lowered its great head until its forehead nearly touched hers. Warm breath ruffled her hair, carrying scents of wildness and ancient forest places. A tremor passed through the earth beneath them, so subtle that only someone raised in the desert would have noticed it. But Itzel felt it in her bones, a resonance that seemed to acknowledge something sacred had just occurred. The bear totem at her throat pulsed with warmth, and for just an instant she could have sworn she heard the sound of drums carried on the wind, the heartbeat rhythm of ceremonies her people had performed for generations beyond memory. Then the moment passed. The bear raised its massive head and turned away, moving with surprising silence for something so large. At the edge of the depression, it paused and looked back at her one final time. What passed between them in that last exchange of glances was beyond words, a promise, perhaps, or a covenant sealed in blood and trust. With a final rumble that might have been gratitude, the great bear disappeared into the maze of rocks and juniper that clothed the desert mountains. Itzel remained where she was for several minutes longer, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. Her hands stung from the wire cuts, and exhaustion was beginning to settle into her young bones, but her heart felt fuller than it ever had before. The piece of barbed wire she kept, a twisted fragment stained with both their blood, would serve as her reminder of this morning when the world had changed forever. As she began the long climb back toward her hidden valley, Itzel carried with her the absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. Behind her, in the rocks where the bear had rested, a single drop of blood fell from a wounded paw onto the ancient stone. The earth seemed to drink it in, and somewhere deep in the desert silence, something vast and patient stirred in recognition of an old debt that would in time be repaid. Itzel's hands shook as she pressed medicinal sage against the cuts that laced her palms and fingers. The morning's encounter felt like a dream now, too strange and powerful to have been real. Yet the pain from the barbed wire wounds was undeniably present, as was the fragment of blood-stained metal she had hidden in her medicine pouch beside the eagle feather bookmark her grandmother had given her for pressing flowers and herbs. "Child, what have you done to yourself?" Ayana's voice carried both concern and gentle reproach as she discovered Itzel cleaning her wounds by the stream that ran behind their wickiup. "I fell while gathering herbs, Mama." The lie came easily, smoothly, though it sat heavy in Itzel's chest like a stone. Apache children were raised to tell truth to their parents, but how could she explain what had really happened? Who would believe that she had freed a giant bear with her bare hands, or that the creature had blessed her with some wordless understanding before disappearing into the wilderness? Ayana examined the cuts with practiced eyes. She had tended many wounds in her life, hunting accidents, ceremonial scarifications, the inevitable scrapes that came from life in the desert mountains. But these cuts were unusual, too precise and numerous to have come from a simple fall. "These look like wire cuts," she said carefully. "Sharp metal, not stone or thorn." Itzel's heart hammered against her ribs. There was old fencing caught in the rocks where the herbs grow thickest, she said, adding truth to her lie in the way children learn to do. "I didn't see it until it was too late." Her mother's expression suggested she sensed there was more to the story, but Apache parents learned early not to push too hard when their children showed reluctance to speak. Instead, she took over the cleaning of the wounds, her touch gentle and efficient. "Next time, be more careful," Ayana said simply. "The world beyond our valley grows more dangerous each day. We cannot afford to lose our children to carelessness." That night, as her family slept around her, Itzel lay awake, staring at the stars visible through the smoke hole at the top of their wickiup. Her hands throbbed with a dull pain that reminded her constantly of the morning's events. But it was not physical discomfort that kept sleep at bay. It was the dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear, not as it had been in the wire trap, but as something larger, more than animal. In her dreams, it walked upright like a man, its fur shimmering with an inner light that seemed to come from the stars themselves. It spoke to her in a language she didn't understand with her mind, but felt in her bones. Words about protection and ancient promises, about the balance between all living things and the sacred duty to preserve it. "Little flower," the dream bear would say in a voice like distant thunder, "the time of choosing comes. The earth itself calls for guardians. Are you ready to answer?" And each time, just as she was about to respond, she would wake with her heart racing and the bear totem warm against her throat. The fourth night after her encounter, the dreams changed. Now she saw the hidden valley from high above, as if she were flying with the eagles. But the peaceful scene was touched with shadow. Riders in blue uniforms moved along the canyon rims, like ants, searching for something. Their leader, a pale man with cold eyes that she somehow knew must be Captain Whitfield, pointed toward her people's sanctuary with naked hunger in his expression. Itzel woke gasping, her small body drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. The vision had felt more real than memory, more urgent than mere nightmare. Something was coming, something that would threaten everything her people held sacred. The next morning brought troubling news that seemed to confirm her fears. A hunting party had returned early, their faces grim with worry. They reported signs of a large military patrol moving through the territory, not the respectful passage of Lieutenant Morrison's men, but something more purposeful and threatening. "They're searching for something," reported Running Wolf, the hunt leader. "Not hunting game, not even tracking raiders. They move like men with a specific destination in mind." Chief Victorio listened to this report with the stoic expression that had served him through decades of dealing with the white man's government. But Itzel, watching from the edge of the group as children were allowed to do, saw the worry that flickered behind his eyes. "How many?" the chief asked. "Perhaps 40 riders. 2 pack trains. They carry surveying equipment and other tools I do not recognize." The word surveying sent a chill through the gathered adults. Everyone knew what it meant when white men came with surveying equipment. It meant they were measuring the land, preparing to claim it, to change it according to their own vision of how the world should be ordered. That afternoon, Itzel found herself drawn to the place where her grandmother prepared medicines and conducted the small ceremonies that helped keep their community in harmony with the spirit world. Nayeli looked up from grinding dried roots, her ancient eyes reading the trouble in her granddaughter's expression with the ease of long practice. "You are troubled, little flower, more than usual." Itzel settled beside her grandmother, unconsciously, mirroring the older woman's cross-legged posture. The eagle feather bookmark lay open beside a collection of pressed healing plants, each specimen carefully preserved and labeled according to its medicinal properties. "Grandmother, do you ever have dreams that feel more real than waking?" Nayeli's hands never paused in their grinding, but her attention sharpened. Among her people, dreams were not dismissed as mere imagination. Dreams were messages, warnings, glimpses of truths that the waking mind was too cluttered to perceive clearly. "Tell me about these dreams, child." And so, for the first time since her encounter with the bear, Itzel found herself speaking truthfully about what she had experienced. She told her grandmother about the dreams of the great bear, about the feeling that something momentous was approaching their hidden valley. She did not yet have the courage to speak of her actual meeting with the trapped grizzly, but even this partial truth felt like a weight lifting from her young shoulders. Nayeli listened without interruption, her weathered face growing more serious with each detail. When Itzel finished, the old woman set down her grinding stone and looked directly into her granddaughter's eyes. "These are not ordinary dreams," she said quietly. "They are visions, messages from the spirit world. Among our people, such gifts usually do not manifest until adulthood, but you have always been different." "Different how?" "You see things others miss. You understand the language of animals and plants in ways that cannot be taught, only recognized. Your great-great-grandmother was the same. She could speak with the spirits of the desert, could heal with her hands alone." Nayeli paused, studying Itzel's face, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "I have been waiting for these signs to appear in you." The old woman reached into her own medicine bundle and withdrew a small, clear crystal that seemed to hold captured sunlight in its depths. "This belonged to your ancestor. It is said to strengthen the connection between the world we see and the world that lies beneath." As Itzel took the crystal medicine stone in her small hands, it grew warm against her palms. Not the heat of sun-warmed rock, but something alive and responsive. The moment she touched it, her vision seemed to sharpen. The ordinary world around her, the wiki-ups, the cooking fires, the people going about their daily tasks, remained the same. Yet somehow she could sense the invisible currents of energy that connected all things. "What am I supposed to do with this gift?" she whispered. "That," said her grandmother, with the gentleness of absolute certainty, "is what the spirits will teach you. But child, be careful who you trust with knowledge of your abilities. In times like these, being different can be dangerous." As if summoned by those words, a commotion arose from the central area of the village. Riders were approaching, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. But these were not the horses of returning hunters. These were the measured cadences of military mounts, carrying men who rode with the rigid precision of soldiers on official business. Lieutenant Morrison had arrived, and with him, news that would change everything. Lieutenant Morrison dismounted from his cavalry horse with the careful respect of a man who understood he was entering sacred ground. Unlike many of his fellow officers, James Morrison had spent enough time among the Apache to recognize the subtle signs that marked this as more than just another Indian camp. The way the wiki-ups were arranged, the careful attention to the natural flow of water and wind, the peaceful expressions on faces that had grown wary at the first sound of hoofbeats, all of it spoke to a community that lived in harmony with forces most white men never bothered to acknowledge. Itzel watched from beside her grandmother as the young lieutenant approached Chief Victorio with the formal gestures of respect that had kept peace between them for the past 2 years. Morrison was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered features and eyes that held genuine intelligence, rather than the casual contempt she had seen in other soldiers. His Apache, while heavily accented, was functional enough to conduct basic diplomacy. "I come with words from Fort Bowie," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "Words that I wish I did not have to speak." Chief Victorio gestured toward the central fire, where such conversations traditionally took place. "Then speak them, and let us hear what the White Father in Washington has decided about our fate." As the formal council began, Itzel felt her grandmother's hand settle gently on her shoulder. The crystal medicine stone seemed to pulse with warmth in her palm, and suddenly she could sense currents of emotion flowing through the gathered people like invisible rivers: fear, anger, resignation, and underneath it all, a deep sadness that threatened to drown them all. "The Department of Indian Affairs has issued new orders," Lieutenant Morrison began, his reluctance clear in every word. "All Apache bands remaining off the reservation are to report to San Carlos within 60 days. The words fell into the circle, like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and dismay through the assembled people. Chief Victorio's expression remained stoic, but Itzel could see the way his hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his knees. "And if we refuse?" The chief's voice carried the quiet dignity that had made him a leader among his people. Morrison's pause spoke volumes. "Captain Whitfield has been given authority to use whatever force he deems necessary to ensure compliance." Murmur ran through the crowd. Not loud, for Apache people rarely showed strong emotion in public, but carrying all the weight of a community facing the end of their way of life. Itzel felt tears prick at her eyes, though she was too young to fully understand the political forces that were converging on their peaceful valley. "How long do we have to consider this?" Chaitin's voice joined the conversation, measured and diplomatic. "The 60 days began counting yesterday," Morrison replied. I argued for more time, but my superiors were firm. They believe that quick action will prevent the kind of violence that has marked other relocations. That night, after Lieutenant Morrison and his small escort had departed, the tribal council met long into the darkness. Itzel could hear the low voices of the men debating their impossible choices, each option worse than the last. Stay and fight, knowing that women and children would die. Submit to relocation and watch their culture slowly disappear in the harsh emptiness of San Carlos, or scatter to the four winds, breaking apart the community bonds that had sustained them for generations. Unable to sleep with such weighty matters pressing on her mind, Itzel slipped away from her family's wickiup and made her way to the small grove where her grandmother conducted healing ceremonies. She found Nayeli there already, sitting in silent meditation before a small fire. "I knew you would come," the old woman said without opening her eyes. "Your spirit is too troubled for sleep." "What will happen to us, grandmother?" "That depends on many things, little flower. On the choices our leaders make, on whether the spirits that protect this land choose to intervene, on whether those with special gifts are willing to use them when the time comes." Nasheli opened her eyes and studied her granddaughter's face in the firelight. "Show me your hands." Itzel extended her small palms, where the cuts from the barbed wire were healing into thin white scars. Her grandmother examined them closely, tracing each mark with a weathered fingertip. "These are not from falling on rocks," Nayeli said quietly. "These are wire cuts, fresh ones. And there is something else." She touched one of the scars that seemed slightly different from the others, darker somehow. "This one has been touched by power, old power." Itzel's heart began to race. "I don't know what you mean." "Child." Her grandmother's voice carried infinite gentleness. "I have walked this earth for 7 decades. I have seen visions, spoken with spirits, witnessed miracles that would make strong men weep. Do not think you can hide the signs of such encounters from these old eyes." The crystal medicine stone grew warm in Itzel's medicine pouch, and suddenly the weight of secrecy became too much to bear. In halting words, she told her grandmother about her encounter with the trapped bear, about the strange intelligence in its eyes, the way it had seemed to understand her intentions, the moment of connection that had left her feeling forever changed. Nayeli listened without interruption, her expression growing more amazed with each detail. When Itzel finished, the old woman sat in silence for several long minutes, staring into the dancing flames. "My child," she finally said, "do you understand what you have told me? You have described an encounter with one of the great spirit guardians, the protectors that were appointed by the Creator to watch over sacred places. But it was just a bear, a hurt animal that needed help. It was never just a bear." Nayeli's voice carried absolute certainty. "The spirits often wear the shapes of ordinary creatures when they walk in our world, but they reveal their true nature only to those with eyes to see and hearts to understand. You have been chosen, little flower. The question now is whether you will accept that choosing." Over the following days, Nayeli began Itzel's formal training in the medicine ways. Each morning before sunrise, they would slip away from the village to gather herbs and conduct the small rituals that connected healers to the spirit world. The crystal medicine stone never left Itzel's side, its warm presence a constant reminder of the path she was walking. Feel the life force in each plant, Nayeli instructed as they knelt beside a patch of desert sage. Every living thing carries its own spirit, its own gift. The healer's task is to understand these gifts and bring them into harmony. Itzel placed her hands on the silvery green leaves and felt immediately the subtle pulse of life within them. But more than that, she could sense the plant's willingness to help, its ancient purpose as a cleanser of both body and spirit. When she spoke to it in the old Apache tongue, asking permission to take what was needed, she could swear she felt a response, not in words, but in a deepening of the connection between them. "You learn quickly," her grandmother observed with satisfaction. "Too quickly for this to be entirely new to you. You have always had this gift, haven't you? Even as a small child, you could calm frightened animals, make sick birds well again." Itzel nodded, remembering incidents she had dismissed as coincidence or luck. The injured hawk that had let her mend its broken wing, the rattlesnake that had chosen to slither away rather than strike when she had accidentally disturbed its rest, the way horses gentled at her touch, even the wild mustangs that usually tolerated no human presence. "But why now?" she asked. "Why are these abilities growing?" "Stronger? Because the land itself is in pain," Nayeli replied, her ancient eyes looking beyond the visible horizon toward troubles that only she could perceive. "When the balance is threatened, when sacred places face destruction, the spirits call upon their chosen guardians to act." As if summoned by those words, a commotion arose from the direction of the village. Shouts and the sound of running feet carried across the morning air. Grandmother and granddaughter exchanged worried glances before hurrying back toward their home. They found the community gathered around a wounded Apache warrior who had ridden his horse nearly to death, reaching them. Blood soaked through his shirt and his face was gray with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes burned with urgency as he gasped out his message to Chief Victorio. "Captain Whitfield," the man struggled for breath. "He comes with many soldiers, not Lieutenant Morrison, the captain himself, with orders to clear all Apache from the territory by whatever means necessary." "How many men?" Chayton's voice cut through the crowd's murmur. "2 companies of cavalry, perhaps 80 soldiers, with mountain howitzers and a Gatling gun." The wounded warrior accepted a cup of water from willing hands. "They burned the winter, camp at Skeleton Canyon, killed everyone who tried to run." A chill silence fell over the gathering. Skeleton Canyon had been home to nearly 40 people, men, women, children, elders, all gone in the name of civilization and progress. "How long before they reach us?" Chief Victorio's question carried the weight of a leader calculating impossible odds. 2 days, perhaps 3 if they stopped to rest their horses. As the implications of this news sank in, Itzel felt the crystal medicine stone pulse with sudden heat against her chest. Around her, the adults began talking frantically about defensive positions, about hiding the children, about whether surrender might spare their lives even if it cost their freedom. But underneath the human voices, Itzel heard something else. It was faint at first, carried on the desert wind like an echo of distant thunder. Then it grew stronger, more distinct, the deep, rumbling call of a bear coming from somewhere beyond the canyon walls. Her hand flew to the wooden bear totem at her throat, and she felt it vibrate in response to that far-off sound. The connection she had made with the great spirit guardian was not broken. If anything, it had grown stronger, more urgent, as the wounded messenger was carried to the healing lodge and the tribal council began its desperate deliberations. 8-year-old Itzel made a decision that would change everything. The bear spirit had called to her once before, leading her to an encounter that had awakened abilities she was only beginning to understand. Now it was calling again, and this time she knew exactly what it wanted. The time for secrets was over. The time for hiding behind childhood was over. Whatever gifts the spirits had given her, whatever purpose they intended for her to serve, the moment of testing had arrived. That night, as her people prepared for what might be their final battle, Itzel slipped away into the darkness, following the sound of drums that only she could hear, toward a destiny that would echo through the generations. The brass military button lay gleaming in the morning sunlight, partially buried in the sandy soil where Captain Whitfield's advance scouts had passed the day before. Itzel picked it up with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of all it represented, the encroaching modern world, the impossible choices her people faced, the end of an age that had lasted since the world began. The button was warm from the sun, but as she held it, it seemed to grow cold against her palm. Through the crystal medicine stone's enhanced perception, she could sense the emotions that clung to it, like invisible smoke, arrogance, contempt, and something darker, the hatred of men who saw her people not as human beings with their own dignity and rights, but as obstacles to be removed. "Little flower, what have you found?" Niley's voice carried concern as she approached through the desert scrub where they had been gathering medicinal plants. Itzel held up the button, its polished surface reflecting the morning light. It fell from a soldier's uniform, one of Captain Whitfield's men. Her grandmother examined the small object without touching it, her weathered face growing troubled. "Such things carry the intentions of their owners," she said quietly, "and the intentions I sense here are not those of men who come in peace." They had awakened before dawn to gather herbs for the healing ceremonies that would be needed in the coming days. But the urgency of their mission went beyond simple preparation. The wounded messenger's news had galvanized the entire village, dividing the people into those who favored immediate flight and those who insisted on making a stand in their ancestral home. As they worked their way back toward the hidden valley, Nayeli began sharing knowledge that she had held in reserve for years, waiting for the right pupil and the right time. "There are healing songs that can mend more than flesh," she said, her voice low and intense. "Songs that can reach into a man's heart and remind him of his humanity. But they are dangerous, child. To touch another person's spirit so directly, it changes both the healer and the one being healed." Itzel absorbed this teaching as she did all her grandmother's wisdom, storing it away like seeds that would sprout when the season was right. But her attention kept drifting to the bear totem at her throat, which had grown increasingly warm as they moved closer to their home. Something was stirring in the spirit world, something that made the very air seem to thrum with invisible energy. They crested the final ridge just as the morning sun cleared the canyon walls, flooding the hidden valley with golden light. But the peaceful scene that usually greeted them was disrupted by the presence of strangers. 3 figures on horseback who moved with the careful deliberation of people trying not to seem threatening. "More soldiers," Itzel whispered, instinctively reaching for her grandmother's hand. "No," Nayeli replied, her voice thoughtful rather than alarmed. "Look more carefully, child. See beyond the surface." Using the enhanced perception that the crystal medicine stone provided, Itzel studied the approaching riders. 2 were indeed soldiers, Lieutenant Morrison and a sergeant she didn't recognize. But the 3rd figure was completely unexpected. A woman in practical riding clothes, her auburn hair pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her posture suggesting both education and determination. The woman dismounted first as the group reached the village center, her movements graceful despite obvious fatigue from long hours in the saddle. She was perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent green eyes and sun-touched skin that spoke of considerable time spent outdoors. Most surprising of all, she greeted Chief Victorio in passable Apache, her accent suggesting she had taken considerable trouble to learn the language properly. "I am Dr. Catherine Brennan," she said, switching to English when it became clear that her Apache, while earnest, was limited. "I come from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and I bring an urgent message that may change everything." Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his expression grim with the weight of news he clearly wished he didn't have to deliver. Dr. Brennan has discovered documents that explain Captain Whitfield's real motives for forcing your relocation, he said. This isn't just about Indian policy. There's something else at stake here. Dr. Brennan reached into her saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with official documents. I've been studying Apache culture for the past 3 years, she explained, documenting languages and traditions that are in danger of being lost forever. But last month, while researching in the territorial archives, I uncovered correspondence that reveals a conspiracy involving certain military officers and mining interests. Chief Victorio's expression remained carefully neutral, but Itzel could sense the sudden sharpening of his attention. Around the circle of gathered people, she felt currents of hope mixing with suspicion. Hope that perhaps this woman brought salvation. Suspicion that any white person's promises were worthless. "Show us," the chief said simply. Dr. Brennan spread the documents on a blanket, her movements quick and precise. Maps, letters, surveyors' reports, all pointing to the same conclusion. "Your valley sits atop one of the largest copper deposits in the territory," she explained. Men like Marcus Calloway have been quietly buying mineral rights throughout this region, but they can't begin mining operations as long as the Apache have treaty rights to the land. So they use Captain Whitfield to drive us out. Chayton's voice carried bitter understanding. "Making us the aggressor so they can claim we broke the treaties first." "Exactly." Lieutenant Morrison's face was flushed with anger. "I've served under Captain Whitfield for 2 years. And I always wondered why he seemed so eager to provoke conflicts with peaceful bands. Now I know. He's been taking money from Calloway and his partners all along." Itzel felt the crystal medicine stone pulse with sudden heat, and for a moment her vision seemed to expand beyond normal perception. She could see the connections that Dr. Brennan's words revealed, lines of greed and corruption spreading like a spider's web across the territory, all converging on her people's hidden valley. But underneath those human machinations, she sensed something else. The land itself was in pain, crying out against the violation that was planned. "What do you propose we do with this knowledge?" Chief Victorio asked, his pragmatic mind already working through possibilities. "I can take this evidence back to Washington," Dr. Brennan replied. "Expose the conspiracy, force an investigation. But it will take time. Weeks, perhaps months, and I'm not certain we can trust the officials in the territorial government not to suppress it." "We don't have weeks," Swift Arrow interjected, his warrior's impatience finally breaking through diplomatic courtesy. "Whitfield comes with 80 soldiers in 2 days. What good will justice do us if we're all dead?" As the debate continued around her, Itzel found herself drawn away from the human voices towards something else entirely. At the edge of her enhanced perception, she could sense a vast presence stirring, something ancient and patient that had watched over this land since the world was young. The bear spirit was gathering its power, preparing for the confrontation that would decide not just the fate of her people, but the spiritual balance of the entire region. The brass button in her palm grew cold as winter stone, and suddenly she understood its true significance. It wasn't just a token of the approaching soldiers. It was a test, a choice between the old ways and the new, between the wisdom of the spirits and the harsh realities of a changing world. Whatever happened in the coming days, 8-year-old Itzel knew that she would play a role that went far beyond what anyone expected from a child. The spirits had chosen her for this moment, and she would not fail them. The silver concho belt buckle caught the afternoon light as Itzel fastened it around her waist, its Mexican craftsmanship representing the complex web of cultures that had shaped the borderlands for generations. Her grandmother had given her the ornate piece that morning, along with instructions that seemed to carry the weight of prophecy. "Today you cease to be only a child," Nayeli had said, her ancient hands trembling slightly as she helped arrange the ceremonial clothing. "The spirits have called you to stand between worlds, and you must dress the part." Now, as evening approached, and the final preparations were made for whatever tomorrow might bring, Itzel stood at the center of a gathering, unlike any in her people's memory. Apache warriors sat beside cavalry soldiers. A white woman's scholar compared notes with tribal elders. Lieutenant Morrison worked alongside Chayton to plan defensive positions that they all hoped would never be needed. Dr. Brennan had spent the day transcribing Apache oral histories with an urgency that suggested she understood these might be the last such stories ever recorded. Her quick mind and genuine respect for their culture had won over even the most suspicious tribal members, though Itzel could sense the underlying sadness in the woman's efforts, the desperate race against time to preserve what might soon be lost forever. "Tell me about the Bear Guardian," Dr. Brennan said as she settled beside Itzel near the central fire. "Your grandmother mentioned that your people believe this valley has a spiritual protector." Itzel touched the crystal medicine stone in her pouch, feeling its familiar warmth. Through its enhanced perception, she could see the scholar's aura, bright, with intelligence and genuine compassion, but shadowed with grief for cultures she had watched disappear across the American frontier. "The stories say that when the world was young, the Great Spirit appointed guardians for every sacred place," Itzel began, falling naturally into the rhythmic cadence her people used for important tales. "Some became eagles to watch from the sky. Others became wolves to run with the wind. But for places where the earth itself held special power, the Great Spirit chose the bear." Dr. Brennan scribbled notes with practiced efficiency, but Itzel could see that she was also listening with her heart. "And this guardian, it still protects your valley?" "Grandmother says it does. She says that when the need is great enough, when the balance is truly threatened, the guardian will reveal itself to those who have eyes to see." As she spoke these words, Itzel became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere around them. Conversations grew quieter. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was stirring in the spiritual realm. At the edge of the firelight, she caught glimpses of movement that her rational mind wanted to dismiss as tricks of shadow and flame. Lieutenant Morrison approached their group, his face troubled with news that could not wait for morning. "The lookouts report signal fires on the northern ridge," he said quietly. "Captain Whitfield is closer than we thought. He'll be here by dawn." The impact of this announcement rippled through the gathered people like a stone thrown into still water. All their careful plans, all their desperate hopes for a peaceful resolution, suddenly compressed into the few hours remaining before sunrise. "How many men?" Chief Victorio's voice carried the calm authority that had kept his people alive. "Through decades of conflict, the scouts count at least 60 riders, plus pack animals carrying the mountain guns. He means to end this quickly." Morrison's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I sent a message to the territorial governor, but even if he received it, there's no time for outside help." Dr. Brennan looked up from her notes, her scholarly composure cracking slightly under the weight of impending tragedy. "In all my research, in all the tribes I've studied, I've never seen anything like what you've built here. This isn't just a hiding place, it's a living example of how traditional and modern ways can coexist, which is exactly why men like Whitfield want to destroy it," Swift Arrow said bitterly. "They cannot allow any proof that their way is not the only way." As the council debated final preparations through the night, Itzel found herself drawn away from the human voices towards something far older and more powerful. The bear totem at her throat had grown so warm that it seemed almost alive, and the crystal medicine stone pulsed with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. Following an instinct she couldn't name, she slipped away from the firelight and made her way to the sacred grove where her grandmother conducted the most important ceremonies. There, in the silver moonlight that filtered through ancient juniper branches, she found she was not alone. Animals had gathered, more than she had ever seen in one place. Desert creatures that were normally enemies sat peacefully side by side. Coyotes next to rabbits, hawks perched calmly above mice, even a mountain lion resting motionless in the shadows. All of them seemed to be waiting for something. their eyes reflecting the moonlight with an intelligence that went far beyond mere animal instinct. And in the center of this impossible gathering, larger than memory but exactly as she remembered, stood the great bear. It was not the wounded creature she had freed from the barbed wire trap. This was something transcendent, something that existed in the space between the physical and spiritual worlds. Its fur seemed to contain starlight, and its eyes held depths of wisdom that spoke of ages beyond human counting. "You have grown, young healer," the bear said, its voice resonating not in her ears, but directly in her soul. "The time of choosing has come." Itzel approached without fear, feeling the silver concho belt buckle grow warm against her waist, as if responding to the presence of ancient power. "I'm ready," she said, surprised by the strength in her own young voice. "Are you?" The bear's massive head tilted, studying her with those ageless eyes. "To stand between worlds requires more than courage, little one. It requires the willingness to sacrifice everything, perhaps even your own life, for the sake of balance." Around them, the gathered animals stirred restlessly, as if sensing the magnitude of what was being discussed. In the distance, Itzel could hear the sounds of her people preparing for battle, weapons being checked, prayers being whispered, final farewells being exchanged. "What must I do?" she asked. The bear spirit moved closer, its presence so powerful that the very air seemed to thicken around them. When it spoke again, its words carried the weight of destiny itself. "Tomorrow, when the sun reaches its highest point and the violence threatens to consume everything, you must choose. Will you use the gifts we have given you to protect only your own people? Or will you reach for something greater, a healing that encompasses all living things, even those who come as enemies?" Itzel felt the crystal medicine stone pulse with sudden heat, and suddenly she could see the threads of possibility spreading out from tomorrow's confrontation like a vast web. Some led to blood and death, the destruction of everything her people held sacred. Others led to understanding, to a new way forward that honored both the old wisdom and the changing world. But all of those better paths required something that seemed impossible: the transformation of hearts hardened by hatred and fear into something capable of recognizing the humanity in their enemies. "I understand," she whispered, though the weight of that understanding threatened to crush her young spirit. The bear spirit touched its great head to hers, imparting a blessing that filled her with warmth and unshakable resolve. "Then go, young guardian. Sleep, gather your strength. Tomorrow you will need all the courage your ancestors ever possessed." As dawn approached and the final confrontation drew near, 8-year-old Itzel returned to her sleeping family with the knowledge that she carried the hopes of more than just her own people. The spirits had chosen her to stand at the crossroads of destiny itself, and she would not let them down. The ancient petroglyphs seemed to pulse with life in the dawn light, filtering into the hidden cave. Itzel traced the carved symbols with trembling fingers, feeling the story they told resonate through her very bones. This was not just Apache history. This was the memory of the earth itself, preserved in stone by people who understood truths that the modern world had forgotten. She had discovered the cave by accident, following her grandmother's instructions to gather sacred white clay from the deepest part of the canyon. What she found instead was a narrow passage that led to a chamber no human foot had disturbed for generations. The walls were covered with petroglyphs that seemed to map not just the physical landscape, but the spiritual geography of the entire region. "Grandmother, you must see this," she had called, her voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. Nayeli had crawled through the narrow entrance with considerable difficulty, her aged joints protesting every movement. But when she emerged into the cave proper and saw what covered the walls, her breath caught in wonder and recognition. "These are older than our people," she whispered, her weathered hands hovering just above the carved images. "These were made by the Anasazi, the ancient ones who came before us. But how did they know? The petroglyphs told a story that reframed everything Itzel thought she understood about her encounter with the bear. The central image showed a massive grizzly, but this was no ordinary animal. Lightning emanated from its eyes, and beneath its feet, the earth itself seemed to crack and flow like water. Around it, smaller figures, human, animal, and spirit, all bowed in recognition of something far greater than themselves. But it was the context that made Itzel's heart race with sudden understanding. The bear was not just the guardian of their hidden valley. According to the petroglyphs, it was the spirit protector of a vast network of sacred sites that stretched across hundreds of miles. Springs, medicine wheels, burial grounds, vision quest locations, all connected by invisible lines of power that converged on their canyon like spokes of a great wheel. The ancient ones knew, Nayeli breathed, her voice filled with awe. They understood that this place was the heart of something much larger than any single tribe or territory. Itzel moved deeper into the cave, following the story as it unfolded across the stone walls. The petroglyphs showed the land as a living entity, its spiritual anatomy mapped out in careful detail. Rivers of energy flowed beneath the surface, connecting sacred sites in patterns that spoke to some greater design. And at the center of it all, the bear spirit stood guard over the balance that kept everything in harmony. But there was more. Later petroglyphs, carved with different tools and showing different artistic techniques, depicted the arrival of newcomers, people with horses and metal weapons who seemed blind to the spiritual currents that shaped the land. The artists had somehow foreseen the conflict between worldviews, the collision between those who saw the earth as sacred and those who saw it only as resources to be exploited. "Look at this," Itzel called, pointing to a section near the back of the cave where the petroglyphs were overlaid with more recent Apache pictographs. Our people knew too. They came here and added to the story. The Apache additions showed the hidden valley as Itzel knew it, but also revealed the deeper truth of its significance. This wasn't just a place where her people had chosen to hide from the white man's wars. It was a location that had been calling to them, drawing them to serve as guardians for something far older and more important than tribal politics. And there, in the newest section of the cave art, was an image that made her gasp aloud. It showed a small figure, clearly meant to be a child, standing before the great bear spirit while soldiers on horses approached from the distance. The child held something in her hands that could have been a crystal or a stone, and from it, lines of power radiated out to touch both the bear and the approaching humans. "That's me," she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Someone knew. Someone saw what would happen and left this as a message. Nayeli knelt beside, her granddaughter studying the prophetic image with growing amazement. Not someone, little flower. The spirits themselves guided the hands that carved this. They have been preparing for this moment longer than we ever imagined. As they examined the cave art more closely, a pattern began to emerge that filled them, both with horrified understanding. The petroglyphs didn't just show the arrival of miners and soldiers, they showed the consequences of their actions. Poisoned water spreading like a cancer across the desert, animals fleeing or dying, plants withering, the great web of sacred sites disconnected and dying as the spiritual heart of the region was torn out by men who couldn't even see what they were destroying. "The copper mining," Itzel breathed, remembering Dr. Brennan's documents. "It's not just about taking our land. If they dig here, if they poison the springs that feed the entire region, the spiritual damage would spread for hundreds of miles," Nayeli finished, her voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. "Every sacred site, every medicine wheel, every place where our people have prayed for generations, all of it would be corrupted." They made their way back through the narrow passage as quickly as Nayeli's age would allow, carrying with them knowledge that changed everything. This was no longer just a conflict between Captain Whitfield's soldiers and one band of Apache. This was a battle for the spiritual heart of the entire Southwest, a confrontation between those who understood the sacred nature of the land and those who saw it only as something to be consumed. When they emerged from the cave, the sun was already climbing toward its zenith, and the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Dr. Brennan was waiting for them, her face pale with urgency. "They're here," she said simply. "Captain Whitfield and his men have taken positions at the mouth of the canyon. Lieutenant Morrison tried to delay them, but—" Her words were cut off by the sound of a single gunshot, followed by shouting voices that carried clearly in the desert air. The confrontation everyone had hoped to avoid was beginning, and time was running out for any hope of peaceful resolution. But as they hurried toward the village center, Itzel felt the crystal medicine stone pulse with sudden warmth. The bear totem at her throat seemed to vibrate with power, and for just a moment she could hear something that made her heart leap with hope. It was the sound of the bear spirit calling, not just to her, but to something vast and ancient that had been sleeping beneath the desert for longer than human memory. The great network of sacred sites was awakening, responding to the threat with a power that transcended anything Captain Whitfield or his mining partners could imagine. The real battle was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with bullets and bayonets, but with forces that most of the participants couldn't even see. At the center of it all, an 8-year-old Apache girl carried the hopes of both the human and spirit worlds, armed with nothing but an ancient crystal, a carved bear totem, and the absolute certainty that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. As they reached the village to find her people making their final preparations for battle, Itzel made a silent promise to the petroglyphs she had left behind in the cave. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk to herself, she would not let the great web of sacred sites be severed. The spirits had chosen her for this moment, and she would prove worthy of their trust. The sun climbed higher, and in the distance Captain Whitfield's voice could be heard demanding surrender. But Itzel knew that surrender was no longer an option. This was bigger than treaties or reservations or the greed of mining companies. This was about the soul of the land itself, and that was something worth fighting for with every gift the spirits had given her. The sacred peace pipe rested in Itzel's small hands like a bridge between worlds, its carved stone bowl warm with the breath of generations who had used it to seal treaties and end conflicts. Her grandmother had pressed it into her keeping that morning with words that still echoed in her mind. "When the time comes, little flower, this will show them that we seek harmony, not war. But be prepared. Some hearts are too hard to hear such messages." Now, as the sun reached its zenith and Captain Whitfield's ultimatum echoed off the canyon walls, Itzel stood at the center of a gathering unlike any in Apache memory. Warriors in traditional dress stood beside cavalry soldiers who had chosen conscience over orders. Dr. Brennan worked frantically to document what might be the last hours of a culture, while tribal elders prepared ceremonies that hadn't been performed. For decades, "Final warning!" Captain Whitfield's voice carried across the desert air with the harsh authority of a man who had never learned to doubt his own righteousness. "You have 1 hour to come out of that canyon with your hands visible, or we will consider you hostile. And act accordingly." Lieutenant Morrison stood near the canyon's mouth, his face a mask of controlled fury as he watched his superior prepare for what could only be called a massacre. Over the past 3 days, he had tried everything within his power to delay this confrontation, sending dispatch riders to the territorial governor, questioning the legal authority for Whitfield's orders, even threatening to file formal complaints with the War Department. But Whitfield had anticipated such resistance and come prepared. "Any officer who refuses a direct order in the field will be arrested for mutiny," the captain had announced that morning, his pale eyes sweeping over his assembled men. "We have our orders from Washington. These Apache have refused to report to their designated reservation. They are therefore in rebellion against the lawful authority of the United States government. But even as he spoke these words, Whitfield's attention kept drifting to the surveyor's maps spread on his field desk. The copper deposits Dr. Brennan had discovered were marked in red ink, along with preliminary excavation plans that would require the complete destruction of the Apache village. The captain's partnership with Marcus Calloway and his mining consortium was about to pay dividends that would set him up for life if he could just clear away the human obstacles that stood in his way. Inside the hidden valley, the atmosphere was one of controlled urgency. Families said their goodbyes with the stoic dignity that had sustained the Apache through generations of conflict. Children were given final instructions and blessings. Warriors checked their weapons one last time, knowing that their few rifles and traditional bows were no match for Gatling guns and artillery. But underneath the surface preparations for battle, something else entirely was taking place. At Itzel's urging, the tribal elders had begun a ceremony unlike any performed in living memory, a calling out to all the spirit guardians of the region, a desperate plea for intervention in a conflict that threatened to destroy more than just one band of Apache. "The connections are still there," Nayeli whispered as she helped arrange the sacred objects around the ceremonial fire. Even after all these years of neglect, the spiritual pathways between the sacred sites remain intact. "If we can awaken them, if," Chief Victorio interrupted gently, "my old friend, we are placing enormous faith in legends that none of us have seen with our own eyes." But as he spoke these words, the chief's gaze fell on his granddaughter, and his expression softened. Over the past few days, he had watched Itzel change from a precocious child into something far more significant. She moved now with a purpose and authority that seemed to come from sources beyond her years. And when she spoke of spiritual matters, even the most skeptical adults found themselves listening. "The legends are more than stories, grandfather," Itzel said, her young voice carrying absolute conviction. "I have seen the bear spirit with my own eyes. I have touched the power that flows through this land. It is real, and it is waiting for us to ask for help." As if summoned by her words, a strange stillness settled over the canyon. The desert wind died to nothing, leaving an almost oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the eardrums. Even the ever-present sounds of insects and small animals faded into silence, as if all of creation was holding its breath. Dr. Brennan looked up from her frantic note-taking, her scholar's mind recognizing that something unprecedented was beginning to unfold. "The atmospheric pressure, it's changing," she whispered, her instruments confirming what her senses already told her. "It's as if a massive storm is building, but there isn't a cloud in the sky." At the canyon's mouth, Captain Whitfield's horses began to show signs of extreme nervousness. They stamped and whinnied, their eyes rolling white with fear of something their riders couldn't perceive. Even the most experienced cavalry mounts seemed ready to bolt, despite their training. "Sir," Sergeant Bradley ventured, "the animals are acting mighty strange. Maybe we should—" "Sergeant, I don't give a damn what the horses think," Whitfield snapped, though his own mount was becoming increasingly difficult to control. "We have our orders, and we're going to carry them out." But even as he spoke, Whitfield felt an unease that he couldn't entirely dismiss as pre-battle nerves. The desert around them seemed somehow more alive than it had moments before, as if invisible eyes were watching from every shadow, every rock formation, every stand of scrub brush. For a man who had built his career on the absolute certainty that superior firepower could overcome any obstacle, the feeling was deeply unsettling. Inside the canyon, the ceremony was reaching its crescendo. Itzel sat in the center of a circle formed by the tribal elders, the sacred peace pipe cradled in her lap, while the crystal medicine stone pulsed with increasing warmth against her chest. Around her, the voices of her people rose and fell in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the canyon walls, but she was no longer entirely present in the physical world. The enhanced perception that came with her spiritual gifts had expanded until she could sense the great web of power that connected all the sacred sites across the region. Each connection point pulsed with its own unique energy, some bright and strong, others dimmed by decades of neglect, but all still linked in the vast network that the Ancient Ones had recognized and mapped in their petroglyphs. And at the center of it all, growing stronger with each moment, was the presence of the Great Bear Spirit. It was not alone. Other guardians were stirring, eagle spirits from the mountain peaks, wolf spirits from the high forests, serpent spirits from the deep, places where underground rivers flowed, all of them responding to her call, all of them gathering their power for what might be the final battle between the old world and the new. "They're coming," she whispered, her young voice carrying clearly despite the growing sound of the ceremony. Around her, all of them, they know what's at stake. Dr. Brennan had moved closer to the ceremonial circle, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her own senses. The air itself seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy, and she could swear she saw shapes moving at the edge of her vision, forms that vanished the moment she tried to focus on them directly. Lieutenant Morrison chose that moment to make his final attempt at preventing bloodshed. Against Whitfield's direct orders, he rode forward under a white flag, hoping to buy just a few more minutes for cooler heads to prevail. "Chief Victorio," he called as he approached the canyon entrance, "I'm authorized to offer new terms. Safe passage to San Carlos for all your people, with guarantees that families will not be separated." The chief emerged from the canyon shadows, his dignity intact despite the desperate circumstances. "And what of our dead, Lieutenant? What of the sacred places where our ancestors' bones rest? Do we abandon them to the miners' shovels?" Morrison's face showed the pain of a man caught between duty and conscience. "I'm sorry, Chief. I can't promise anything beyond safe passage for the living." It was then that the first sign of something beyond normal experience manifested itself. A shadow passed overhead, far too large to be any bird, moving with a majesty that made both men look up in wonder. For just an instant, the silhouette of a massive eagle was visible against the sun, its wings spanning impossible distances. But it was gone so quickly that both men might have dismissed it as a trick of the light, if not for what happened next. The desert around them began to stir with life, not the normal scurryings of small creatures, but something far more purposeful and organized. Coyotes emerged from hiding places and sat, watching the human drama with intelligent eyes. Hawks circled overhead in numbers that defied natural explanation. Even the usually nocturnal animals, owls, ringtail cats, grey foxes, appeared in broad daylight to witness what was unfolding. "What in God's name?" Morrison breathed, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm before stopping. Whatever was happening, it was clear that violence would be worse than useless. Back at the army position, Captain Whitfield was discovering that his own men were beginning to show signs of the same unease that had affected the horses. Hardened cavalry veterans, men who had faced Apache warriors and Mexican bandits without flinching, now looked around nervously at a landscape that seemed to pulse with invisible menace. "Sir," Corporal Jenkins ventured, his voice tight with barely controlled fear, "maybe we should wait for reinforcements. Something ain't right about this place." Whitfield's response was cut short by a sound that froze every man in his command. From somewhere deep in the canyon came a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, the challenge of something vast and ancient and utterly beyond human authority. The final confrontation was about to begin, and all the participants, human and spirit alike, were gathering their forces for a battle that would determine not just the fate of one Apache band, but the spiritual future of the entire American Southwest. 8-year-old Itzel rose from the ceremonial circle, the sacred peace pipe in her hands and the light of otherworldly purpose shining in her dark eyes. The moment prophesied in ancient petroglyphs had arrived, and she was ready to fulfill her destiny as a bridge between worlds. The rainbow obsidian mirror caught the sunlight like captured fire as Itzel held it aloft, its polished surface reflecting not just the physical world around her, but something far deeper, the true spiritual nature of every soul present in the canyon. Through its depths, she could see the threads of connection that bound all living things together, the invisible web of energy that most humans had forgotten how to perceive. Captain Whitfield's ultimatum had expired moments before, and his artillery pieces were trained on the canyon mouth. But as Itzel began the ceremony that would either save or doom them all, something extraordinary began to manifest. The great bear spirit materialized not as the wounded animal she had once freed from barbed wire, but as a being of pure spiritual power that seemed to contain the essence of the land itself. It stood 20 feet tall, its form shifting between solid matter and living light. Ancient wisdom blazed in eyes that had watched over this sacred ground since the world was young. When it spoke, its voice resonated not through the air, but through the very bones of the earth, causing stones to tremble and making the soldiers' weapons seem suddenly trivial. "I am the guardian of this place," the bear spirit declared, its words reaching every human present, regardless of their position in the canyon. "I am the keeper of the balance, the protector of the sacred web that connects all life. Who among you would dare to break what the Creator has made?" Captain Whitfield's response was to order his artillery to fire, but something unprecedented happened. The guns simply would not discharge. Triggers pulled, mechanisms functioned perfectly, yet no explosion came. The gunpowder remained inert, as if the very chemistry of destruction had been suspended in the presence of something greater. "Impossible," Whitfield snarled, drawing his sidearm only to find it equally useless. Around him, his men were discovering the same phenomenon. Their weapons had become nothing more than elaborate clubs, powerless against forces they couldn't understand. Dr. Brennan stood transfixed, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes were recording. The bear spirit was clearly visible to everyone present, its massive form casting shadows that fell exactly as they should in the physical world. Yet instruments designed to measure electromagnetic fields were registering readings unlike anything. "In the scientific literature, document everything," she whispered to herself, her hands moving automatically to record observations that would challenge every assumption about the nature of reality. "Whatever this is, it's real, measurably, undeniably. Real." Lieutenant Morrison found his paralysis breaking as wonder replaced fear. He dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward the manifestation, his military training warring with an instinctive recognition that he was in the presence of something sacred. "I see you," he said simply, his voice carrying the respect of a man acknowledging a superior officer. "What do you want from us?" The bear spirit turned its attention to the young lieutenant, and Morrison felt the weight of judgment that came from being truly seen. Not just his actions, but his intentions, his struggles with conscience, his genuine desire to serve something greater than political expediency. "You have tried to choose honor over orders," the spirit replied, its massive head nodding with something that might have been approval. "That choice has not gone unnoticed, but the test is not yet complete." At the center of the ceremonial circle, Itzel began to sing in the old Apache tongue, her young voice carrying melodies that seemed to have been woven from starlight and desert wind. The obsidian mirror in her hands began to pulse with inner radiance, and suddenly everyone present could see what she saw, the true nature of their spiritual selves reflected in its depths. Captain Whitfield appeared in the mirror as a man consumed by shadows, his soul twisted by greed and hatred until little humanity remained. But even there, buried deep beneath layers of corruption, a tiny spark of the boy he had once been still flickered. A child who had dreamed of being a hero, who had joined the army to protect rather than to conquer. His soldiers saw themselves with similar clarity. Some were revealed as fundamentally decent men caught up in a system that demanded they abandon their conscience. Others carried the stains of genuine cruelty, their souls darkened by atrocities committed in the name of civilization and progress. But the Apache present were not spared such judgment. The mirror showed their anger, their thirst for revenge, their own capacity for violence and hatred. It revealed the truth that all humans carried within themselves the potential for both great good and terrible evil. "This is what the spirits see when they look upon us," Itzel explained, her voice carrying with preternatural authority. "Not the uniforms we wear or the color of our skin, but the choices we make, the love or hatred we carry in our hearts." The bear spirit moved closer to the assembled humans, its presence so powerful that the air itself seemed to thicken around them. When it spoke again, its words carried the weight of ultimate truth. "The earth itself is in danger," it declared, "not from any single tribe or nation, but from the blindness that makes humans forget they are part of a greater web of life. The mining that threatens this place would poison waters for 1,000 miles. The destruction of these sacred sites would sever connections that have existed since the world began." As if to demonstrate this truth, the spirit gestured toward the canyon walls, and suddenly everyone present could perceive the vast network of energy that connected their location to sacred sites across the continent. Lines of power stretched in every direction, to ancient burial grounds, to medicine wheels, to places where generations of indigenous peoples had performed ceremonies that maintained the spiritual balance of the entire region. The revelation was overwhelming in its scope and implications. This was not just about one band of Apache or one copper mine. This was about the spiritual health of an entire continent, about whether humanity would choose wisdom or destruction in its relationship with the living earth. The transformation began with Captain Whitfield himself. As the bear spirit's words resonated through his consciousness, something cracked in the armor of hatred and greed he had built around his soul. The obsidian mirror's reflection showed him not just what he had become, but what he had the potential to be. And for the first time in decades, he remembered the young cadet who had sworn an oath to protect rather than to plunder. "My God," he whispered, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. "What have I done?" The bear spirit regarded him with eyes that held no condemnation, only infinite patience and the possibility of redemption. "You have forgotten who you are," it replied, its voice gentler now, carrying healing rather than judgment. "But forgetting is not the same as being lost forever." Around the canyon, similar transformations were taking place as the mirror's truth reached into every present soul. Soldiers who had seen Apache people as faceless enemies suddenly perceived them as families protecting their children, their ancestors, their very identity. Apache warriors who had prepared to die in hatred found their anger dissolving into something deeper, a sadness for all that had been lost, but also hope for what might yet be preserved. Dr. Brennan knelt beside her instruments, tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what she was witnessing. This was not just a supernatural phenomenon, it was a moment of collective awakening, a healing that touched every person present, regardless of their previous beliefs or allegiances. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his uniform suddenly feeling like a costume from a play he no longer wanted to perform in. The orders from Washington, the mining consortium, all of it was built on lies, wasn't it? The bear spirit nodded slowly. "Truth has a way of revealing itself when people are ready to see it. Your Captain Whitfield has been taking money from men who would poison this land for profit. The Apache have never been the enemy. They have been the guardians of something far more valuable than copper or gold." As this revelation sank in, Morrison turned to address his men. "Lower your weapons, all of you. We came here under false pretenses, serving interests that have nothing to do with duty or honor. But the most profound change was happening within Captain Whitfield himself. The bear spirit approached him directly, its massive form radiating not menace, but compassion. As it drew closer, Whitfield could feel the corruption that had consumed his soul beginning to burn away like morning mist before the sun. "I can see the money changing hands," he said, his voice breaking with shame and wonder. "I can see the lies I told myself to justify it. I can see the children I would have made orphans for the sake of Marcus Calloway's profits." The spirit reached out with one enormous paw, and as it touched Whitfield's forehead, something miraculous occurred. The captain's pale, cold eyes that had looked upon Apache families as obstacles to be removed, suddenly filled with the light of recovered humanity. "The choice is always before us," the bear spirit said, its voice carrying the wisdom of ages. "In every moment, we can choose to see others as separate from ourselves, or we can remember the truth that all life is connected, all suffering matters, all healing is possible." Itzel stepped forward, still holding the obsidian mirror, but now also carrying something else, a crystal formation that had not been there moments before. It was a bear claw transformed into living stone, pulsing with the same inner light that filled the great spirit guardian. "This is our gift to you," the bear spirit said, addressing not just Itzel, but all the humans present. "A reminder that the connection between worlds is real, that the balance between all living things can be maintained if people of goodwill choose to work together." As the crystal bear claw settled into Itzel's small hands, she felt a completion that went beyond anything she could have imagined. The frightened child who had freed a wounded animal from barbed wire was gone, replaced by someone who understood her role as a bridge between the human and spirit worlds. "What happens now?" Dr. Brennan asked, her scientific curiosity finally overcoming her awe. The bear spirit began to fade, its form becoming translucent as it prepared to return to whatever realm spirits inhabit when they are not walking directly in the world of matter. But before it departed entirely, it spoke one final time. "Now you choose," it said. "The Apache will remain in their valley, not as prisoners on a reservation, but as the guardians they have always been. The mining will not proceed. The evidence of corruption will reach those in Washington who still remember that honor matters more than profit. And all of you, soldiers, scholars, and indigenous peoples alike, will help to preserve not just this place, but all the sacred sites that maintain the spiritual health of this continent." Captain Whitfield, his face streaked with tears of genuine remorse, stepped forward. "How can I possibly make amends for what I've done, for what I was prepared to do?" The bear spirit smiled, an expression that seemed impossible on such a massive, wild face, yet conveyed more forgiveness than any human words could have managed. "By spending the rest of your life serving the truth you have seen today," it replied. "By using your position and knowledge to protect rather than exploit. By remembering that redemption is not a destination, but a daily choice." As the great spirit finally faded from visible manifestation, it left behind more than just the crystal bear claw. It left a group of people fundamentally changed, bound together by an experience that would shape the rest of their lives and the future of the land they had been fighting over. 50 years had passed since the day when a small Apache girl stood between worlds and helped heal a conflict that could have destroyed far more than one hidden valley. The woven memory blanket lay spread across Itzel's lap as she sat in the late afternoon sunshine, its intricate patterns telling the story that had become legend throughout the Southwest, the tale of the bear spirit's gift and the transformation of enemies into allies. Now an old woman herself, with silver threading through her long black hair and wisdom lines mapping the geography of her weathered face, Itzel ran her fingers along the blanket's careful stitches. Each scene had been created by the women of her tribe, working together to preserve not just the events of that extraordinary day, but the deeper truths it had revealed about the connections between all living things. The central panel showed The great bear spirit in all its majesty, surrounded by the circle of humans who had witnessed its manifestation. Apache and cavalry soldiers stood side by side, their weapons lowered, their faces reflecting the wonder of people seeing clearly for the first time. Dr. Brennan was depicted with her notebooks and instruments, recording observations that would eventually help establish the first indigenous cultural preserve in American history. "Tell us again about the crystal, Grandmother Itzel," requested one of the children gathered around her, a mixed-blood girl whose Apache mother had married a former cavalry sergeant who had stayed in the territory after his transformation in the canyon that day. Such marriages had become common in the decades following the bear spirit's intervention, as the artificial barriers between peoples had dissolved in the face of shared understanding. Itzel reached into the medicine pouch that still hung around her neck, withdrawing the crystal bear claw that pulsed with gentle warmth at her touch. Even after 5 decades, it remained as clear and radiant as the day the spirit had gifted it to her, its faceted surface catching and reflecting the desert sunlight in patterns that seemed to hold their own inner meaning. "The crystal reminds us that gifts of the spirit are not meant to be hoarded," she said, her voice carrying the measured cadence of a master storyteller. "They are meant to be shared, to heal, to bring understanding where there was once only fear." Around her, the hidden valley had grown and changed, but not in ways that violated its essential character. The original wiki-ups still stood, maintained, now not just for daily use, but as teaching spaces where young people learned the traditional ways. But alongside them were newer structures, a school where Apache children learned to read and write in both their native tongue and English, a clinic where Dr. Brennan's successors practiced a unique blend of modern medicine and traditional healing, and a research station where scholars from universities across the country came to study indigenous wisdom. The copper mine had never been built. Captain Whitfield's testimony before a congressional committee had exposed the corruption that reached from territorial officials to the highest levels of the Interior Department. Marcus Calloway and his associates had faced both criminal charges and financial ruin. Their mining consortium dissolved, and its claims on Apache lands declared null and void. But more important than any legal victory was what had grown from the spiritual transformation witnessed that day. The network of sacred sites revealed by the bear spirit had become the foundation for the first comprehensive conservation effort in American history, as people who had once seen the land only as a resource to be exploited began to understand it as a living system worthy of protection and reverence. Itzel had played her part in that transformation, serving for decades as a bridge between the traditional Apache leadership and the growing environmental movement. Her unique abilities, enhanced by the crystal bear claw but rooted in a lifetime of spiritual practice, had made her a sought-after healer and mediator. Politicians, scientists, and indigenous leaders had all sought her counsel on matters ranging from water rights to wildlife preservation. Lieutenant Morrison, now Colonel Morrison in his retirement, visited the valley regularly. His own transformation that day had led him to dedicate his military career to peaceful solutions rather than conquest, pioneering new approaches to conflict resolution that were being studied at West Point and other military academies. He had never married, choosing instead to serve as an advocate for indigenous rights and environmental protection. Even Captain Whitfield had found his own path to redemption. After his military discharge, he had spent years working without pay to undo the damage his previous actions had caused. He had died 10 years earlier, but not before establishing a foundation that funded environmental restoration projects across the Southwest. His funeral had been attended by both Apache elders and former cavalry veterans, united in their respect for a man who had found the courage to completely transform his life. Dr. Brennan's documentation of that miraculous day had revolutionized anthropological studies, introducing concepts of spiritual ecology and indigenous wisdom that had gradually gained acceptance even in the most conservative academic circles. Her detailed records, including photographs of the bear spirit that had somehow appeared on film, despite the supernatural nature of the manifestation, were now housed in the Smithsonian Institution as part of a permanent exhibit on Native American spirituality. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Itzel carefully folded the memory blanket and prepared to return to her family's wickiup. Around her, the sounds of evening filled the air, children laughing as they helped with evening chores, adults discussing the day's work, the eternal murmur of water flowing over stone in the stream that had given life to this place for countless generations. But underneath those familiar sounds, she could hear something else, the deep, contented rumble of a great bear, satisfied with the choices made and the balance preserved. The spirit guardian had never again manifested in visible form, but its presence remained, watching over the sacred network of sites that continued to pulse with life and power across the continental landscape. The crystal bear claw grew warm in her hand one final time as she touched it to her lips in the ancient gesture of gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve as a bridge between worlds, new chances to demonstrate that understanding was possible even in the face of the greatest differences. But tonight, surrounded by the living proof that hope and healing could triumph over hatred and greed, Itzel was content to rest in the knowledge that some gifts, once given, continue to bless the world for generations beyond measure.